Excellent. So, hello everyone. Welcome back to the second International Colloquium on the Metaphysics and Semantics of Fiction. Right now, we have John Gibson's presentation. I'm going to make a brief introduction and then the presentation is going to start. So, John Gibson's research focuses on topics in aesthetics and the philosophy of literature, and he is especially concerned with connections between these areas and central issues in the philosophy of language and the philosophy of the self. Much of his recent research explores the uniqueness of the forms of meaning artworks bear and the implications this has for accounts of the cultural, ethical, and cognitive significance of art. He is currently co-PI on the TRT-funded project titled Knowledge, Perception, and the Prospects of Criticism. At the University of Louisville, he teaches courses on the philosophy of art, the nature of the self, Plato and Nietzsche, and he has developed a 200-level course that introduces students to philosophy through literature and film. He is a member of the steering committee of the PhD in Humanities. He has published very influential books, including Fiction and the Weave of Life in 2007, and he has also edited very important collections such as The Routledge Companion to Philosophy of Literature with Noel Carroll in 2015. He has also published several papers like Cognitivism and the Arts in 2008 and Interpreting Words, Interpreting Worlds in 2006. So today, Professor Gibson is delivering the conference Criticism, Aboutness, and Cognitivism. So John, thank you very much for accepting our invitation. It is an honor to have you here.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that introduction, to Jerzy and Italo for the invitation. It's lovely to be here. I'll say a few things before I get started. The first is that I just arrived in Sweden, so even though it's light outside, it's rather late in the evening, so I will apologize for my tired voice. I'm in an apartment for guest researchers, and I'm hoping the internet will work for the next hour and a half. It's been a little bit spotty since I've arrived. I'll say a little bit about why I'm here. It's the grant that Italo just mentioned, since it will give a sense of what I'm going to be talking about. I'm working with Elizabeth Schellekens here at the University of Uppsala on a project titled Perception, Cognition, and the Prospects of Criticism. We're at the very beginning of our three-year project, working on this for the next 3 years. And what I'm doing today is trying to spell out the philosophical dimension of the argument we're trying to make. Since we're at the beginning of the project, that means that in certain places where you'd expect an argument, I'll just have a hypothesis or a suggestion. But I'm very grateful to be able to present this here. I'm here working on it, and it's a wonderful moment to get feedback, right? We want this project to take off, and the kind of feedback I'll get from you will be very helpful. What else should I say? I'll say that I've been told many times by people I love and respect that when I use PowerPoint online, it's excruciatingly boring. So today I will not use PowerPoint. I have notes, and I will try to speak through this, and hopefully it will not be excruciatingly boring. If at a certain point you can't hear me or you need me to speak up, please just on mic and let me know. Because I'm going to talk through this, I'm going to keep it a little bit shorter. We have an hour. I shouldn't go on for more than 40 minutes, and that will leave time for conversation and discussion. All right, so with that, I'm going to switch screens, and hopefully you still see me. Yes? I would hear it if you couldn't see me any longer.
Yes.
So, all right, good. I'm going to start with a paper. And try to give you a sense of what this bold position that we're working on will look like if we can make good on all the argumentative promises we made in the proposal. So we'll see. A familiar, if equivocal, cultural belief is that artworks at times succeed in yielding insight into reality, into the world, as we can vaguely but acceptably put it. A common, if contentious, belief amongst contemporary philosophers of art is that these insights are often delivered through those features of an artwork that explain its status as a work of art, through its form, its beauty, through its expressive character, its emotional tenor, its imaginativeness, and so on. Stated conjunctively, we have a version of the thesis of aesthetic cognitivism. Artworks, one, bear cognitive value, of course, and two, this cognitive value is in some manner encoded, embodied in the intuitively art-making features of a work of art. And those features of a work of art that establish its claim to being a work of art, right, and not something else. So we don't just want to show we can learn from a work of art, we can learn from anything under the sun. We want to show that we can learn from those features of a work of art that establish its claim to being a work of art, from its aesthetic features, for example. An idea that aesthetic cognitivism will insist on is that artists do not create works with cognitive value by abandoning their aesthetic pursuits for a moment and doing whatever it is that historians, scientists, and philosophers do. It may be the case that artists at times make genuine assertions or construct a sound argument. I doubt it, but unless they do so in a manner that respects the two conditions just outlined, they merely provide us with reasons for ascribing cognitive value to assertions and arguments. And such a thing is hardly in need of defense. I think a lot of some recent work in the field makes this mistake. So the philosophical issue is how the aesthetic and broadly artistic features of art can be endowed with forms of meaning that render intelligible questions of cognitive value in the first place. Put casually, the philosopher who explores aesthetic cognitivism wants to know how all that artistic matter we find in artworks can at times prompt forms of cognition as well as aesthetic experience. What that matter is will depend on the art form one is exploring. But the general idea is that it must play an indispensable role in structuring the cognition an artwork seeks to make available to its audience. Henceforth, I'll just speak of cognitivism, not aesthetic cognitivism, just to save a minute or two. But when I say cognitivism, I'm referring to the thesis of aesthetic cognitivism as I just outlined it. Now, some will demand more from the thesis of cognitivism than my statement offers. For instance, certain philosophers will argue that the cognitive insight an artwork offers must be, going over some options from the literature here, intended by the author, non-trivial, propositionally or conceptually structured, both true and in some manner justified, good luck with that, and much else besides. The list of possibilities is very, very long, which is to be expected since philosophers naturally develop their defense of cognitivism in line with their general commitments in epistemology, logic, metaphysics, and of course, the philosophy of mind. Yet most parties to the debate will agree that the version of cognitivism just stated is a basic requirement. The thesis of cognitivism, as I present it here, captures what you might call the foundational issue, in the sense that its modesty affirms the ground level problem on which more ambitious accounts must build. The first order of business in a defense of aesthetic cognitivism is to establish what it means to say that the real can so much as be encountered in artworks that are fictional, fantastical, radically abstract, composed only of musical sound, and so on. An answer that is worth building on must explain how a work uses the resources of art making to make this encounter possible, and in a way so as to invite a cognitive vocabulary to explain features of this encounter, what earns us the right to apply a cognitive vocabulary to features of aesthetic experience. That's what I'm trying to identify here. So I will assume this sense of cognitivism and suggest a new way of defending it. My argument begins by motivating an account of how the imagination contextualizes meaning-apt aspects of artworks to create this initial link between an artwork and extra-artistic reality. And I'll say as an aside, nothing metaphysical hangs on my use of the word reality. I use reality in an absolutely everyday sense, so don't expect much to happen by way of a theory of reality. It just happens to be the realm that we contrast with great ease from the worlds that we read in a work of fiction, for example. Whatever reality is, it's a world in which agency functions in a certain way, and so does practical reasoning. I'm not interested in a metaphysical notion of reality beyond that. So there are two central points I will draw from this. The first is that imaginative immersion in an artwork is often a matter of making present to reflection broader real context in which we situate certain of the local features of an artistic representation. We know, for example, to read James Baldwin's fictional representation of a lynching in Going to Meet the Man in light of very real features of American history and the forms of racism endemic to it. In this way, allowing our imaginative engagement with Baldwin's fictions to lead us to altogether real cultural context. So that gives you a good sense of what hangs on this notion of reality here. It's a world where these things happen. This will yield a workable sense of how we establish artistic aboutness, with aboutness here, in my usage, understood as the content of critical statements that articulate the bridge that we take to run between an artwork and the regions of actual cultural, political, psychological reality that an artwork appears to fashion into an object of attention. In my usage, aboutness identifies, if you will, a work's worldly subject matter. The idea is that in appreciation, we're expected to harness the imagination in the service of making these patterns of aboutness, real aboutness, manifest. The consequence of which is typically the establishment of an image of or perspective on the real world. This will identify a kind of meaning, I argue, that is central to the experience and criticism of art. I will say more about this notion of aboutness below. For the moment, it will suffice to characterize it as what we state in interpretations that specify the real subject matters which artworks invite us to see explored in their abstractions, aesthetic forms, expressive structures, and fictions, as the case may be. The second stage of my argument breaks thoroughly with common practice in this debate. Much current work in aesthetics makes absolutely everything hang on what we find of cognitive significance in a specific work of art, or failing that, in a consumer's mind in the wake of an encounter with a work, both taken in isolation from those practices and institutions which structure the creation and appreciation of artworks. An example of this is Greg Curry's recent book, which is an excellent book, but it exemplifies this approach that I'm critiquing now. This approach smacks of a kind of methodological individualism that should give us pause. I argue that we cannot offer a satisfying defense of cognitivism if we approach the issue by considering either consumer or artwork in isolation from our critical practices, where by critical practices, I gesture in the general direction of the public social dimension of appreciation and interpretation. The sociality of this dimension, embodied in our various critical practices, allows us to identify forms of sense-making and indeed rationality that we will not see if we limit our attention to what we find in the interior of a specific work of art, as so much work in this field does. And I'm guilty of that in almost all of my past work. So I criticize even myself here. Thus, the version of aesthetic cognitivism I want to motivate can be called critical cognitivism. And it's a defense of the cognitive value of art and not just of criticism, because it tries to show that our critical practices play a role in articulating the cognitively relevant content of a work. As consumers of art, we are constantly drawing from a reservoir of established, publicly circulated ideas and expectations about artistic aboutness, often cooked into the very concept of an artistic genre, movement, or practice. So I tell you that a poem is an example of high modernism. That gives you already a lot of a perspective and a set of expectations about what it will be exploring. Crudely, modernity is a kind of catastrophe. But so these ideas of aboutness are often cooked into the notion of a genre, or of a practice, or of a movement. So in those cases where philosophical defense of the cognitive value of a specific work is possible, that reservoir will contain information of sufficient sophistication that such a defense is given the kind of rational support that entitles us to invoke the vocabulary of cognitivism. So the idea is that it is by situating ourselves in these essentially public critical practices that whatever happens in our private encounters with art gets linked to established structures of reason-giving and sense-making such that the total experience can be seen as including a cognitive element. I don't deny that you can learn from art when you read in the privacy of your bedroom, but because private, it's not going to be linked to these social networks that can endow the whole activity with a form of rationality, reason-giving, sense-making. That's the idea. This is not an extravagant claim. If we think back to a state of pre-academic innocence, most of us can recall encountering a now cherished artwork that we had once experienced as, in effect, a mystifying question mark. It was the experience I had when I read T.S. Eliot's Wasteland when I was 14. That was a terrible idea. I did not understand it at all. So we found the work on our first encounter thoroughly inaccessible, perhaps because it was an exercise in radical experimentation in a medium with which we were unfamiliar, or just supremely weird. Yet once we came to learn something about the relevant genre, the artistic movement of which the work is an instance, or the standing projects of the author, we suddenly could see the work is shot through with sense, significance, and purpose. My claim is that experiences like this tell us something about what happens behind the scenes of appreciation, not just in respect to challenging art, but really most of it, often in a sort of second-natured way. Criticism, in the expansive sense I urge here, is that region of the art world that creates many of the resources we employ in such acts of perceptual and imaginative bootstrapping, acts that permit us to see in artworks structured forms of aboutness that often cannot be read off of their semantic and perceptual surfaces. So the great problem of meaning in art, really in literature, is that we ascribe such nuanced forms of meaning to works of literature that in no way can be reduced to anything those works actually say. Yet we still experience those meanings as part of the literary work's communicative project. That needs to be explained, and this is one way of getting there. In this respect, consumer, work, and criticism are all three implicated in a nexus that itself delivers the desired cognitive goods. Cognitive value, as it were, accrues to the relationship between consumer, work, and criticism. That's where we should be looking at it. One final word before I start my argument. One will notice that I rarely, in fact, never use two terms that animate so much work in this debate: truth and knowledge. The approach I outline here looks on low rather than on high, seeking to identify ground-level forms of sense-making and rationality in the social dimension of our critical practices. Thus, I'm interested in identifying how forms of understanding get elaborated in the exchange between artworks and the critical traditions that arise around them. For example, in the forms of argumentation, reasoned disagreement, conceptual innovation, and philosophical discovery that are visible in, if not Hamlet the play, then in the great critical debates that the play has prompted. Just read Schopenhauer and Nietzsche's criticism, or any of the German romantics, on Shakespeare, and you see what you have a sense of what I'm talking about. Thus, the version of aesthetic cognitivism I defend is very modest. But a modest cognitivist, in case there are any here, should be able to see how they can lead my position to much more ambitious destinations. So much of my work, I'm a cognitivist, but I tend to be skeptical that the notions of truth and knowledge play much a role in a defense of aesthetic cognitivism. Broader forms of understanding are usually what I find relevant. As a first step, we need to bring a measure of clarity to our often very loose talk of seeing the world or reality in art. For its part, the history of the philosophy of art is full of attempts to explain precisely this. Aristotle's claim that poetry deals generally with what happens necessarily or for the most part, while speaking specifically about fictional characters and events. Hegel's belief that in art we see the sensuous presentation of the idea, or Merleau-Ponty's notion that the experience of art in part consists in relearning to see the world, are a few such examples. For much of the history of aesthetics, it was expected that a proper theory of art explained how we are put into sensory or imaginative contact with the real through works of art, or explicitly to explain this assumption away, as some forms of aestheticism and formalism preferred to do. In analytic philosophy of art, the grandness of such historical models has given way to rigorous accounts of the nature of representation, imagination, and fiction, and in a manner that, on the face of it, has not been very hospitable to these historical models. This is not because of any anti-cognitivist animus amongst contemporary aestheticians, I don't think. It's rather that, perhaps exactly as one would expect, the better we understand what it means to claim that an artwork has, in Gregory Curry's terms, an imaginative project, the harder it is to take these historical models at their literal word. Many philosophers of art accept a broadly Waltonian account of the role of imagination in the experience of art. A defining feature of Walton's theory is that it fictionalizes the mimetic dimension of art nearly entirely. Notice I said nearly. For Walton, to be fictional is to function as a prop in a game of make-believe, and the imagination itself is identified with this capacity to transform objects into the props that sustain games of make-believe. In the case of narrative art, such as literary fictions, the descriptions that yield narrative content itself function as such props. I quote Melville here, Ahab threw his brooding soul into his unfaltering hunt is a prop in sentential form that yields a fictional representation of the famously obsessive captain. In a painting, it will be aspects of a colored surface that become the props that make imaginatively present a wizened old man holding a blue guitar. In a work of absolute music, a descending minor arpeggio will furnish the prop for imagining of the music that it represents a human expressing melancholy. In all of these cases, it is fictional that I see an old guitarist, hear a gradually deflating human sigh, or learn about a quest for an elusive whale. One might protest that certain artistic examples of portraiture, documentary film, historical fiction, and lyric poetry in fact offer, at least on occasion, straightforwardly faithful depictions of the actual world. Perhaps, but it is irrelevant to a defense of aesthetic cognitivism, since the problem is precisely that of explaining the cognitive value of works that speak about invented rather than actual states of affairs, whose images are in obvious excess of what the standards of representational fidelity to the real world will permit, works that assert, in whatever way they do, the artistic prerogative of representational autonomy. A defense of cognitivism that strives to expose works that do not assert this autonomy will thus offer a solution for a class of artworks that do not display the relevant philosophical problem. So we need to be looking at the fictionality, the abstraction, and works of art, the very things. Another way of putting this is I'm moving away from the idea that the link to reality gets established representationally, comes in elsewhere. So not everyone is a Waltonian about these matters, of course. Some of the papers at this conference have made that very clear. But here's the rub. If we choose to redescribe imagination and representation in non-Waltonian ways, we should expect our redescriptions, if sound, to lead to the same destination, that understanding the imaginative projects of artworks obliges us to acknowledge their autonomy from the burden, operative in nearly all practices with cognitive goals of representational fidelity to the real world. Autonomy in this context is a loose term that gathers under its scope a great array of ideas about art that assert that artworks can, and in fact frequently do, create representations that in no literal sense attempt to picture or describe the actual and are appreciated as such. We all know this. Philosophers of art will disagree about how to describe this autonomy, and no one sensible would claim that it is categorical or absolute, but it will appear in any theory of artistic representation worth its name. All right. So criticism. So back to my initial question, how should we model talk of seeing the world in art? How do we make sense of this language? In light of the above, exactly what do we find in artworks that can support the pervasive idea that they are often in part about the real world? Where does that come in? It is here that it becomes especially important to look at examples of criticism, since critics routinely make statements of aboutness, the logic of which suggests a surprising way forward, or so I think. While the examples I explore are not especially cognitively ambitious, they do highlight important features of the nature of critical statements of aboutness. And that is what I'll focus on for the next few minutes. So don't expect the examples of criticism to make interesting knowledge claims. They don't. They just exemplify features of aboutness that I think are important for this debate. So my argument is not at all that these critical examples impugn against our standing theories of fiction. I think they're compatible with them. It's rather that they imply a different interpretive and appreciative game altogether. And the issue will become one of understanding the interconnectedness of these various dimensions of a work. For example, how the interconnectedness of its fictionality alongside its real aboutness. So I'm going to start very simply. I'm going to use an example just from the New Yorker. It's an altogether familiar kind of popular critical statement. It's not going to surprise you at all, but it reminds us of how critics speak and the particular register in which they speak and make certain claims about the political significance of works of art, for example. So I'm going to start with the theater critic Ben Brantley concluding his review of a performance of the recent play Fairview. And Fairview is a brilliant play. And if you haven't seen it, I urge you to watch it. You can see it online. So Brantley says of Fairview, here it is, I quote, "As you may have inferred, Fairview is all about race, and especially about how white people look at Black people. More broadly, you might argue, it's about the defective lens through which we view one another and the world around us. But no, it is all about race," end quote. Again, not very ambitious. But what's important to see is that we'll distort our understanding of Brantley's language grotesquely if we take his critical statement to be a description of what obtains in a merely fictional world. It's a perversion. Brantley's claim is expressly about how the work is about us and our world. His point is that there is a defective way white people look at Black people, perhaps even a defective way we view each other and the world generally, and that the play is about this. It would be linguistically incompetent and culturally inappropriate to assume that Brantley, in asserting this, implicitly prefaces it with, "It is fictional that," or "the play invites us to make believe that," or most unforgivably, "in the world of the work, it is the case that." And it would be inappropriate because of the way this interpretive maneuver would convert a claim expressly about how the work turns aspects of social and cultural reality into an object of attention, into a claim now about something else, and something that could never sustain the intended ethical and political force of the claim, namely fictional events obtaining in a merely imagined world. So his speech act, as it were, needs to be analyzed in a way that's very unlike the way we analyze fictional utterances. So consider a different and slightly more ambitious example. Here's poetry critic Stephanie Burt on Michael Palmer's lyric poem, Letters to Zanzotto. Burt says that the lyric poem, here I quote the passage, pays homage to the many possibilities, the openness in any life that has yet to come to an end, though especially somebody still young. We are all in the same kind of boat, the sailing ship desire traversing the waves of us. We are always setting out. Some of these quotes are references to the poem itself, of course. Life does not answer our fundamental questions, but replaces them with more questions. Each question must both articulate and put to rest some earlier version of itself. The stories we tell or retell are the same kind of stories, no matter how much their details, nets, embers, and folds, lines from the poem, differ. They show us how we grow up, pursue our goals, succeed or fail, and then die. That's the end of the passage. What is striking in this example is the ease with which Burt attends to discrete units of meaning in the lyric as establishing these patterns of aboutness. We see that there are at least two ways of attending to props in a Waltonian sense as content generators. One, which is key to Walton's own theory, is to see them as prescribing an imagining that articulates the fictional representation a prop generates. It generates fictional content, right? It's to attend to props as elaborating an element of a work's story world, to use Stacy Friend's very useful term here. Yet Burt does not seem to be primarily interested in attending to the props in Palmer's poem in this manner, though one assumes that that is happening too. The second way of attending to a prop that Burt's criticism brings to our attention, one that Walton's not particularly interested in, brings to our attention is attending to the a prop as inviting us to make imaginatively present, not fictional states of affairs, but those features of the world that account for a portion of the prop's social and cultural meaning. Lines like, this is from the poem Bert's discussing, lines like "the waves of us" and various talks of embers and nets clearly generate, as perhaps all metaphors do, a kind of imaginative experience. But Bert's critical practice focuses on articulating the significance of these props as so imagined. And she gives voice to this in a very, very specific manner by ascribing to them forms of what we might as well now just call real aboutness. As she says, they show how we grow up, pursue our goals, succeed or fail, and then die. The second way we attend to props that I'm trying to highlight here extends a work's imaginative project so that it becomes inclusive of the features of social and cultural reality that we specify in our statements of aboutness. We're supposed to make the world somehow imaginatively present in these acts. Bert moves from prop to establishing an imaginative link between the poem and a real ontological context. The world of the work, in this case, is our world, and not primarily a fictional or abstract one. Bert's critical activity works to make manifest the social and, if you will, existential context we're expected to imagine the poem to address, in addition to the fictions it may address. Crucially, throughout the passage, Bert grounds her statements of aboutness in properly artistic material, in the figurations, images, and allusions that constitute the poetic function of the lyric's language, which, for Bert, resides in the force of the patterns of aboutness as embodied in these poetic declarations. It is aesthetic just to the extent that the poem's insights are conveyed poetically, not as detached ideas, but as a perspective on the real that is encoded in the imagistic dimension of the poem's poetic deployment of language. One could ask for a more detailed formal and aesthetic analysis of the poem, but in Bert we have enough to justify claiming that the images of and perspectives on the world she elicits from the poem are embodied in intuitively art-making features of Palmer's lyric. So to conclude this line of thought, it's true that we might find ourselves in a context such that we come to see in these works exactly what Brantley and Bert do, but without at all having to rely on their critical significance, their critical guidance. I am not claiming that unless we read Brantley or Bert, we can never see these things in a work of art. As we'll see in a minute, however, this is because we too can assume the role of a critic. And we do so by situating ourselves in the very interpretive and cultural practices that Brantley and Bert do. We therefore grant ourselves access to the ideas that are available to them. So I'll start making some medium to large size points here. We'll see how they work. I've identified a form of aboutness that I hope makes earthbound the idea that we can in some manner see the world in works of art that insist on their representational autonomy. So we can grant that they're not offered representations of reality. That's important, of course, if we look at absolute music or abstract art, yet still can forge a kind of connection to the world. This form of aboutness identifies, in effect, a distinct variety of seeing in, an imaginative stance that makes internal to our conception of a work those features of actual human circumstance, often integral to grasping the significance, import, and point of an artistic representation. We also saw how these statements of aboutness function in two altogether standard sorts of critical contexts, and that these critical statements of aboutness, in an important sense, partly realize the meaning of artworks by bringing to reflective awareness a communicative property that cannot simply be read off of a work's semantic or perceptual surface. Again, the forms of meaning the critics ascribe to the works are irreducible to something, in the case of the poem, that the poem actually or literally says. Nonetheless, we take it to be an expression of its meaning. Now, what I've looked at so far obviously says little about the cognitive significance of such statements of aboutness. To identify the conditions under which such statements of aboutness are cognitively interesting, we'll need to shift perspectives pretty radically. Before introducing this shift in perspective, a brief word about an entirely wrong way of thinking about the epistemological status of the critical statements of aboutness I've already considered. So I'm going to elaborate this wrong view now that I think skews the entire way we think about these issues. So the crude idea is that until a form of epistemic support is offered them, these statements of aboutness are mere assertions about the nature of racialized perception or the cycle of life. They are perhaps justified as statements of the subject of a work, but nothing in these examples of critical discourse furnishes a reason to think that they are justified, even compelling, in respect to the way they organize perspective on extra artistic reality. I'm still elaborating the wrong view. That a work is thus and such, the crude idea has it, in no way motivates us to think that the world is thereby thus and such. Simply put, the statements of aboutness provide, at best, the initial provision of an image of the world, the truth of which a philosopher, if so inclined, can then scrutinize. But the crude idea has it, until the process has begun, these statements are, from a cognitive point of view, unmotivated, ungrounded. The silliness of such a view is obvious. Artworks are created and criticism is conducted in a cultural context. They're situated in, to use Arthur Danto's phrase, an atmosphere of art theory. That is, a set of inherited ideas that includes not only conceptions of the nature and point of art, but all those features of social and cultural reality that animate the concerns of art making and its criticism at a given juncture in an art world's natural history. Brentley's criticism draws on vital and open-ended discussions in both American theater and intellectual life about race and person perception that was initiated 117 years earlier in the work of W.E.B. Du Bois, probably earlier than him, but. And Burt stands on millennia of ideas in art and elsewhere about the course of human life and its conclusion, unfortunately, in death. None of this implies the establishment of justified true belief in these critics' statements about reality, where we don't have anything like that at this point. But as social epistemologists often remind us, when looking at groups and the cultures in which they are housed, we often find what remains occluded if we look at solely individual expressions of belief taken in isolation from their cultural source, varieties of justification and warrant that are passed on through fairly reliable social networks of sense-making. I'm going to make the same claim for critical practices. Is functioning the way social epistemologists think that many of our epistemic practices do. This is enough to reveal the folly of viewing these works in the forms of aboutness they give rise to in segregation from those features of artistic and social life that account for their provenance and which typically offer a basic scaffolding of rational support. And that's all I want. That's what I'm after in my defense of cognitivism, just to find some basic scaffolding of rational support. So after all, these critical claims, these critical statements of aboutness are generated through the machinery of cultural critique and social scrutiny. And the labor conducted in these broader contexts of examined life puts these Dantonian ideas in circulation and thereby provides both artists and critics with a set of standing questions, interests, and anxieties to explore. To this extent, it is usually wrong-headed to see critical statements of aboutness as the initial statement of an image of the world that awaits epistemic attention. Their histories have provided a respectable amount of such attention, and both artist and critic, since not denizens of the void, give expression to these histories and the forms of rationality embodied in them when they go about their business. This brings us to the more general shift in perspective just promised. What the above makes salient is the very thing that is missing in standard philosophical approaches to work on the cognitive value of art. Common practice in the philosophy of art approaches cognitivism by taking all the relevant variables, artwork, consumer, and critic, in radical isolation from the practices in which all three make sense as the very things that they are. These practices determine and make publicly available a conception of the nature of their respective roles, as well as the norms for the assessment of their creative and critical behavior. And here it perhaps suffices to remind ourselves of what we already know, that if we expand our view and consider what we find displayed across the expanse of our critical practices, especially as they coalesce in traditions that arise around sets of artworks, We will find the provision of arguments, the giving of reasons, the principled scrutiny, the making sense of those features of artworks that prompt the attribution of real aboutness that can ground a version of aesthetic cognitivism. I'm going to wrap up in a second. In this respect, criticism as a practice is the art world example of what I just described as reliable social networks of sense-making. The cognitive value of art is part of the rational scaffolding of the forms of intellectual and creative sociality that make the art world possible. And they're only in full view if we attend to those critical practices that structure all of this. It is through these practices that our understanding and sensitivities to art are educated, coordinated, and coordination is incredibly important to explain how in multitudes we can all turn to the same works of art and have similar aesthetic experiences and derive similar forms of meaning. So this in part answers that coordination problem, right? And these are turned into possibilities of shared experience. These practices are fundamentally critical in nature on the model I'm advancing here. On this model, the forms of real aboutness suggested in artworks are realized socially through the creative interplay between artworks, consumers, and critics. So the critical attribution of real aboutness to a work, when such there is, will therefore typically exhibit a kind of justificatory force, since in the critical debates through which they are fashioned, revised, and defended, we often find exactly what we do not find in most works of art, the provision of reason support. In the critical debates surrounding Sophocles' Oedipus Rex, to give a ridiculously familiar example, that's why I choose it, of course we find arguments of both literary and philosophical import for treating it as, to elaborate some of the common readings, a play that raises a powerful question about the role of fate in human life, an illustration of the fragility of the self, and an imaginative demonstration of the limits of our knowledge of ourselves and those around us, a stance on the sources of tragedy in human life, an exploration of the difference between the pursuit of happiness and the mere avoidance of suffering, among much else. It may be the case that we rarely, perhaps never, find critical convergence upon the truth when we explore disagreements and attributions of aboutness in the critical traditions that arise around specific works, as we certainly do not in respect to the history of criticism of Oedipus Rex. They do not converge on anything like the truth. In criticism, as in philosophy, disagreement is endemic, yet if this seems an epistemic failure, there is no convergence on the truth. Note immediately that the road to failure is surely paved with many small to medium-sized cognitive accomplishments. We get reason-saturated acts of sense-making that distill into a statement of aboutness a complex image of, and so way of understanding, an aspect of the human predicament. We should suspect that it is critical disagreement itself that prompts this. And this disagreement is arguably the very thing that is productive of this rational scaffolding. In fact, the very thing that ensures against criticism devolving into the mere expression of subjective impression. Final point. This approach to aesthetic cognitivism is a bottom-up model of art's cognitive value, and it is ultimately truth indifferent. If most approaches to cognitivism start on a high by exploring how specific works can be seen as leading to an imagined consumer to a kind of worldly truth, this model seeks to identify forms of rationality operative in our critical practices, such that a class of statements of aboutness can be seen as generated in an epistemologically respectable way. This shows that at times these statements of real aboutness are grounded in reasons, not that they're true, and thus that the forms of social and cultural understanding they encode admit of analysis in terms of rational support, not that they have shown to be unassailable or count as justified true belief. We do not get that. A certain kind of philosopher will find none of this satisfying until we can explain the conditions under which these forms of aboutness get the world right in a deeper philosophical sense. If one wishes to engage in this philosophical quest for truth, one is welcome to do so. My argument is simply that when this further cognitive project is initiated, we will leave behind our art world critical practices and the forms of understanding they pursue. We won't be able to use this model to defend cognitive value for those more ambitious projects. I am going to stop with that, so thank you very much. I hope I've not gone on too long, a little bit perhaps.
This is perfect. Thank you very much, Professor Gibson. It was a brilliant presentation, and we can now open the session for discussion.
Thank you to the whoever's applauding. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Awesome. I would like to make the first question, and I think that your account is very obviously critical of everything that's being made in analytic philosophy on the philosophy of fiction, because we are having a hard time to say that, for example, a given work of fiction is about, let's say, racism or about a revolution or about love or about friendship or about whatever subject matter it might be, because usually we assume that, as you were saying, there is the world of fiction, and we
Mhm.
are trying to understand or to discover what kind of illocutionary force is at stake when an author writes a work of fiction. And is it pretense? Is it a declaration? Is it a directive? And so on. And I think you're right. Maybe that's too instrumental for what is important when it comes to fiction.
Right.
So, yes, works of fiction are related to our culture, are related to the way we think about ourselves as human beings, and so on. But if I want to bite the bullet, in a sense, uh, how exactly is this aboutness working? I don't want to rely on speech act theory in order to understand this
Yeah.
problem right now, but is it working like a metaphor, for example, for about what it is to be human, or is it working like some sort of thought experiment that we can operate when we read a work of fiction, and once we create this thought experiment, we derive the arguments of the work in a sort of
Yeah.
metafictional way. So, how am I supposed to understand the relationship between fiction and what really matters about life in this new perspective?
Right. So that's very helpful. And yeah, I do want to point out again that I am criticizing sort of business as usual in debate, but I'm responsible for that. So this is, I wrote a book on precisely what I just criticized. So I like one way to think about it, and this might be what the suggestion consists in, right? We have really rich accounts of the speech acts that writers of fiction engage in. And they're extremely helpful for understanding the nature of fiction. They're not very good for cognitivism. Those, for the reasons I went, they tend to lead us to an account of literature that fictionalizes our understanding of the entirety of the content of a novel. That's not good for those of us who have take seriously the ethical and political dimensions. Put a different way, you can see the concern I have is it's a kind of metacritical debate. So one of the questions I have as a philosopher who's and spends a lot of time with people in literary studies. If you listen to the ways we talk about literature and go to a conference in literary studies, it's so different. All they talk about is the political, ethical, and psychological dimension of art. And so the question for me is, I guess I see this debate as metacritical in the sense I want to give an account of cognitivism that can ground these standing habits in other disciplines, in literature, for example, or fine art, of talking about artworks. And I want to get there by not canceling or overlooking the really rich work we've produced. I love Walton, for example, about what it means to utter a fictional, to engage in a fictional illocutionary act. But I want to look at the kind of illocutionary acts critics engage in and see those as important at telling us what it means to appreciate a work of literature as a work of literature. And I think if you look at the language of criticism, it functions. No, I've never read a critic who says it is make-believe that, right? Or maybe if they're talking about a fairy tale, for example, but they just don't talk that way. You see their language has a really different logic. And one of the things that I tried to highlight really in the example of Bert is a skill you see displayed in great criticism is how they attend to the fictional discourse, but see it as functioning to communicate more than fictional content. And that's what the idea behind real aboutness. So they attend to fictional discourse by asking what's significant in the content as imagined. And in specifying that, it often gives them a really linguistically elegant way to start talking about the way in which the work engages not just fictions, but the world beyond it. So I want to see these two dimensions as hanging together. I like what you said before. I wrote a paper on this like 7 years ago and decided I was wrong, but your thought made me think maybe it wasn't that wrong. I'm not here committed at all to the idea that we're treating the work as a metaphor, though I think that's an attractive idea. Arthur Danto has one of his best lines is, we treat a work of art as a metaphor of life, and life itself is transfigured. And so it's an attractive idea, but I'm not committed to the vision of life being metaphorical at all. I think a lot of these meanings in the form of the kind of aboutness I've tried to identify is just implicit in a work. It's an account of what its purpose is and why one tells a story that way, right? It's to say this about race, or it's to say this about the course of human life. So it's implied in some manner, but I also take it to be implicit in the text. I could say more about that, but then I'd go on for 20 minutes about the way meaning functions in non-linguistic, for example, in the context of visual art or music, and I'd bore everyone to death with that, but I can come back to it. Excellent question. Thank you for allowing me to clarify some of my points. Thank you.
Awesome. And if later on you feel like talking these 20 minutes on this subject matter, feel free to do that because we're going to enjoy it a lot. But thank you very much. All right, do we have more questions or more comments or a point for discussion? Hannah.
Hi, Hannah.
Yeah. Hi, John. Good to see you. Thank you for the talk. I always learn a lot, and I thought that it was really generative. So like lots of thoughts. And I always like it when bad habits of analytic philosophy gets called out in a lot of ways. So in that spirit of joining in, I don't know, self-critical mode. I was really struck by what you said about, criticism being a really culturally embedded practice, and, the kinds of insights that it can bring is often going to be culturally kind of contextual as well, right? So the example you gave with the critic, it's, sure, it's all about race, but I imagine they're not saying it's about race per se, right? What they mean is like it's race as embodied and practiced and manifested in the US at a particular time. And so that got me thinking, and here's the actual question part, that got me thinking about whether we might diagnose the philosopher's resistance to cognitivism by remembering our like shared fetishization of generalization, right? We don't want just life, we want life universal, the human condition. Like we want the thing that like applies everywhere all the time, timelessly so. Or because we think that's like what philosophy is about, right? We want the universal. And so if that's the case, it's no surprise that we forget that these art practices are the contingent and contextual and kind of could have been otherwise. And it's I'm like torn because I feel like there is something to abstraction and the importance of kind of, burning away the dross of everyday, maybe the irrelevant parts of the everyday. But at the same time, this desire for something universal, like, distorts a lot of our practices, like you said, of criticism, of art making. So I don't know, it's a tension of sorts. Maybe it's an explanation of sorts, why philosophers are the only ones who are skeptical that we can learn from art, which is so wild, right? Like,
the demands they place on art are very, very high indeed. So yeah, I completely agree. Excuse me, I interrupted.
Yeah, no, sorry, I don't have a Chris question. It's just like I'm honestly a little flummoxed. I feel a tension of sorts.
I think that's great. I mean, I think I don't really do this here, but if we're going to engage in this self hatred or self questioning of the kind of work we produce, another way to approach it would just be to look at how limited our resources are, and acknowledging the kinds of insight works of art tend to be interested, which tend to be highly particular, context dependent. So think about it, we've talked about this before, everyday art, right? It's not going for some God's eye point of view, but we just don't have a really rich cognitive vocabulary for explaining those sorts of insights is important, right? You might have to offer a philosophy of life or some different account to be able to enfranchise those sorts of insights into our theory. So I agree with that. About the cultural practice, I mean, one thing that strikes me about the way I've been thinking about these issues, and I think many people who work in them do think about them, is I called it earlier an example of methodological individualism. right? But just think about the ways in which we try to operationalize when we go empirical some of these tests. We count how many times somebody blinks while looking at a painting. And that's a person considered in complete isolation from the world around them. I mean, we're literally taking a person out of a cultural context and just seeing what happens to them individually when they encounter a work of art. And that should be suspicious at least, right? And so I do have a bizarre notion of criticism. It's not just what you find in the New Yorker or in an English class, for example. It's a much more sort of Wittgensteinian notion of a practice. But if we don't think of those broader practices, when we consider what happens in your mind or the mind of an individual consumer of art, we're going to lose access to all those resources that help explain how they identify meaning and how whatever they're encountering in the work of art gets led to something that is supported in an interesting manner, supported in the way critics support anything they say about a work of art. So at the very least, it starts displaying forms of rationality and sense-making that we're never going to see if I just think about what happens to me on a beach with a book, or counting the number of times I blink when I'm looking at a painting. I'm not sure I've answered your question, but it was a very open-ended question. It provoked many thoughts, but I think you're absolutely right.
No, yeah, that is helpful and it answers the question. I'm reminded of how you were pointing to the social epistemologists at times, right? Because they've also started recognizing that, look, it's not just about individuals, there's this kind of collective relevance as well. And so, yeah, it's great to see this in aesthetics, and honestly, hope to, generalize outwards from here, right? See how it plays out in this cognitivism discussion, but it's a bigger movement, honestly, that ought to have taken up.
That's right. Thank you very much. Nice seeing you. It's been a while.
Good to see you.
This is great. I would like to raise another question, if that's possible, after Jersey, of course. Jersey, please.
Okay, thank you, Italo. Yes, thank you for the excellent talk, Professor Gibson. It's been great. Got me thinking a lot about how to view the literature in philosophy of fiction and about cognitivism. I have just a clarificatory question, and then another which would be more sort of to the metaphysical underpinnings of your views. So first, the clarificatory question. You were saying that your account of cognitivism would be a bottom-up approach. It's not entirely clear to me what would be the bottom level and the top level in this case. So, and the second question would be, does this account of aboutness and so it seems to me that there is some kind of perspectivism about as a general outlook on the nature of reality that is underpinning this notions. What would you say about that?
So so one of the reasons I don't get very particularly excited about the terms truth and knowledge in these debates is so I can acknowledge a proliferation of perspectives, different works of art offer them. They can have a cognitive value. They can convey understanding. And of course, some understandings can be false, but nonetheless, they open up ways of thinking about the world that are entrenched in our cultural practices, right? But I'm not at all committed to the claim that they get the world absolutely right. So that's one of the reasons I stopped. So I wouldn't be, if I were to go into metaphysics or epistemology class, I certainly would not endorse something like a perspectivalism as a view, right? But I get excited about the ways in which works of art offer real images of, or real perspectives on the world. And I want a position that can acknowledge that and not think that can see that as productive as something of cognitive value rather than standing in the way. So when I say bottom up, I mean, it's starting in the roughness of our critical and cultural practices. I guess that's all I mean by bottom up. It's starting in the messiness of our actual form of life, to use a phrase Wittgenstein will sometimes use, and not starting from a position, the kind of theoretical position that wonders under which conditions can a work of art functions as a thought experiment spell out those conditions, and then go see if you can, good luck with this, find a literary work that actually satisfies those conditions. It'll usually just be one or two that can do that. So I find that approach really frustrating. But it's motivated by an account, the ground level part, the starting on low. It's motivated by account of how our critical practices function and how our critical practices show something about how cultures use works of art as lenses through which to see the world or convey information about it. And that's going to leave us with a considerable amount of, it's not going to get us beyond critical disagreement and the fact that with any work of art, we find ourselves at a point at which it doesn't make much sense to ask which of these interpretations is correct. And when we get to that point, it also seems to suggest that we can't ascribe a truth to it or a specific insight that's been justified in a particular kind of way. I don't feel like I'm being particularly clear in answering this question. I haven't thought about that in those terms, but so I've never thought of myself as a perspectivalist. I'm struggling with what that would mean and how to address it. But does that make sense? I mean, I'm not interested in understanding when literary works get the world right in some categorical or philosophical sense. I am interested in the machinery of culture and how that generates ways of taking the world to be that turn into forms of social understanding that we use to navigate the world, some of which are going to turn out to be false. Every great modernist poem, for example, either turns out to embrace a ridiculous fascist or communist politics. We still read them and we can find pretty good forms of insight that they communicate. And I think our theory of cognitivism has to be loose enough, modest enough that we can accept those features of our literary culture, that they're shot through with things that from a philosophical point of view turn out to be false, but still see them as engaging in a kind of cognitive labor. Anyway, I'll stop with that, but thank you for the question.
No, it's great. Thanks. Very, very helpful. Yes.
Awesome. So I'd like to raise an anthropological question regarding fiction, actually. Because if there is aboutness involved in fiction, if we can, okay, I'm not going to say we can learn through fiction or acquire knowledge through fiction. Okay, I'm going to put that to the side. But if the real issues are addressed by fiction, and before this institution, we already had mythology, for example, what happened in the history of humanity that we left mythology to the side and started being interested in fiction? And more specifically, again, a really general question, would you agree that fiction is something that was created in the 16th century in Europe, maybe with Cervantes, or it goes back to the ancient Greek and they were also doing fiction? So how can I identify what is about fiction, what is about mythology? Why should I adopt any genre in order to talk about the things that matter? And again, a general question, but I would love to hear your answers about that.
So I would certainly agree that the novel is a modern invention, though there's always the problem of Petronius' Satyricon that seems like a postmodern novel thousands, way before it's even possible. I don't think I have anything good to say about when fiction replaces mythology, though, or art more generally, because I take them to be coextensive and they're different ways of communicating an understanding of the world, right? So I like your question. I mean, it's important to go back to that, understanding the historical role of art. Narrative is remarkably effective at organizing information. Right? It might be that selves are narrative creations. We use narratives to piece together and make coherent the world in all sorts of ways. I like to think of poetry, this is probably wrong historically, but as sort of the mother of all the arts. I mean, in poetry, from the painterly dimension of poetry, you get the imagistic dimension of art. Painting from the narrative, that might lead to literature and eventually the novel. From rhyme, for example, you get musicality, and so much is condensed in poetry. And so I think it's really interesting to think about the ways in which, I just taught a course on Plato this year, and it was a lot of fun to think about the ways in which philosophy, art, and mythology are all competing as sort of the workstations, the workplaces of human understanding, what their individual affordances are. But there's a lot more So I've never thought about this, but I'm going to venture and answer your question. One of the great things about art that makes it seem much more sophisticated, fiction in particular, than mythology, is it reveals the lie, and it's explicit about its fictionality. And that's probably a huge human advancement, to figure out how to tell stories without making them speak on behalf of the truth, right? Claiming that they speak, they somehow get the world right, yet still convey a kind of understanding. That's a pretty extraordinary accomplishment. Sort of midway between mythology and, I guess, what philosophy and the beginning of our scientific traditions. But that's a very undisciplined hypothesis. As I said, I haven't thought about this before. Do you have anything you'd like to add to that? It's a very interesting question. I wonder if anyone else
Well,
has.
maybe a personal experience actually, because I'm working at a university here in Brazil that is on the countryside,
Mhm.
and I have we call it a culture project. I was working on it last year, in which we are going to the countryside of the city where I'm at in order to hear and register the narratives of the people that live in farms and in,
Yeah,
outside of the city in this sense. And sometimes people ask me, well, but why are you doing that as a philosopher? Maybe that's an issue for someone who works with anthropology. Maybe you should read, I don't know, Dante or Goethe or not to do this kind of job, but every time I listen to these narratives, I learn a lot from it, and I can't explain how that happens,
yeah,
because there is a lot of culture involved regarding the Portuguese that were in this specific region and things that are being passed on for ages, one family to the other, things that are mixed with religion and different kinds of religion, not only Catholics, but also, I don't know, it's a huge mixture. And
yeah.
I'm interested in that, and I can't explain why, actually,
Uh,
because
yeah.
I can
It-
learn
it-
from it in a sense that I can't learn from philosophy, for example.
yeah, that's great.
So that's where I'm standing in this question.
Yeah, narratives are interesting to the extent they convey perspectives. And from like Liz Camp's work, one way to think about perspectives is they organize the way we think about some region of interest. They take a whole bunch of information and make it hang together, make that information hang together in a certain way so we can think about it in a structured manner. So perspectives aren't about the conveying of a precise bit of information, but the organization of a whole mass of it. And narratives can do that. And of course, that's a kind of holistic understanding. It's very hard you're not going to pull a specific content out of that and say, this is what this is about. But they allow you to think productively about a whole range of issues. So the sort of cognitive acquisition might be manifested in the not true statements you can make, but the different ways and the new ways, the perhaps improved ways you can go on to speak about a whole range of issues because of this accomplishment and perspective taking. Yeah, great. I love that. That's great. That sounds like a really interesting project.
Yeah, thanks. Jean?
First, I would like to thank you for your work. Reading Fiction, The Weave of Life was a watershed moment for me.
Thank you.
My
I make
question,
all the mistakes in that book I just criticized. Keep that in mind, but thank you so much.
my question, how do you think we could speak about fictions as means of moral education from your perspective? Could we, how?
Okay, yeah. So yeah, that's a very good question. One of the fun things that's been a lot of fun about this project I shared with you today, but also a challenge is, so in this sense, I'll say to Jersey, I'm definitely not speaking on low, but on high. We're trying to talk about all the arts. And so not focusing specifically on fiction, but trying to understand, approach the problem in a way that gets you from absolute music to painting to literature. So so if the account works, it works for a lot more than fiction, and it's not fiction specific. It doesn't tell you exactly. Part of the reason for that is I think my account, it isn't grounded, or it doesn't identify cognitive value at the level of representation. And when I think about fiction, I tend to think about fictional representation. So it's a little broader than that. What it does, I guess, is say that to the extent you can find aboutness in anything from a work of absolute music to a novel that's just apparently about fictions, think about The Trial, you can still get to the world in relatively similar ways. And the idea of criticism helps us get us there. So I think to answer that question, how do we learn from fictions? Well, look at how fictions are communicated as literary works, right? As stories that are circulated in a culture and around which certain critical traditions arise. And I don't mean literary professors, I mean just ways of talking about art and its point, and that we all have access to in a certain sense. So fictions function for education when you get all these things like English literature courses, and people who write about literature, and people have good ideas about them, and they share them in public spaces. And this gives you that, what Arthur Danto calls that atmosphere of ideas, of art theory, that allow fictions to do this work. Put it a different way, if we could go back, as Italo wanted us to like our prehistory, before we had fictions, if somebody came up with a fictional text, we wouldn't be able to say we learned from it or ask or answer the question, does it have cognitive value, unless we wait long enough for some of this social work to happen and some of these critical traditions to arise. And they probably arise, they're probably coextensive. I think that's how most art historians think about it. Before we could look, our ancestors could look at a painting of water buffalo on a cave wall and not see it as a map, but see it as an invitation for aesthetic immersion. Someone had to produce an idea. There had to be some cultural accomplishment that made it possible for us to engage with representations right in an aesthetic way rather than informational. So I guess my point would be that we need to look not just at the fiction, but the cultural activity surrounding it that would help explain how we understand how it's possible that we could learn from it if we do. And I should be clear, I mean, I've read many really bad books. I read one on the airplane here to Sweden that was just awful. I don't think I learned a single thing from it. It never went beyond fictional level of representation. There is no interesting form of aboutness. So I don't want to claim that I certainly don't want to claim that all works of art do this, right? So
thank you very much.
Mm-hmm.
Excellent. We still have time for questions. Would anyone like to raise a question? Maybe the last question of this session? Awesome. So, Professor John Gibson, thank you very much for your presentation. It was, I would say, brilliant because it made me think about what I wanted to say as a philosopher of fiction. But for some reason, I've been led astray to discuss some really interesting problems about speech acts in fiction, for example. I'm not saying that I'm going to leave it all behind or say that it's
You
useless or
should.
anything, but you called attention to the fact that there's a blind spot here, and we're missing what maybe is the most important thing about fiction, which is things we can say and learn, and the aesthetic experience of it, and how it changes our mind about important themes related to our culture. And I'll definitely pay more attention to that as a philosopher per se. So I would like to thank you very, very much. It was really enriching, really fruitful for, at least I'm going to say for me, but of course for more people. So thank you very much.